England, 1814. It was June of 1814 when Lady Hartswood's chandeliers first set Louisa trembling beneath their light. Some women are taught to be invisible. Louisa Hartwell had mastered the art far too well. The chandeliers of Lady Hartswood's ballroom cast their golden light across the assembly, illuminating silk gowns in shades of cream, rose, and palest blue. The orchestra struck up a quadrille, and couples moved across the polished floor in mechanical precision, each gesture choreographed by years of social expectation. Yet in the shadowed alcove near the refreshment table, Louisa stood motionless, her aging white muslin gown rendering her nearly invisible against the damask walls. The fabric had been fashionable 5 years prior, when her father still lived. Now it hung from her frame like a relic from another era, its yellowing hem a quiet testament to neglect. At 21, Louisa had already learned that survival required the abandonment of hope. She watched the younger debutantes with their glossy ringlets and radiant complexions, their laughter bright and artless as they angled for advantageous introductions. They did not yet understand that beauty was currency, and currency could be revoked. They had not yet learned the particular terror of irrelevance. "You will remain here." The voice came from behind, low and edged with alcohol. Louisa stiffened, though she did not turn. She knew the cadence of that voice intimately, the way it shifted between false civility in public and something far more dangerous in private. Henry Colton, the second Earl of Asherton and her legal guardian, swayed slightly as he gripped her wrist. His fingers were warm and damp, and she felt the familiar knot of dread tighten in her chest. "Do not embarrass me further tonight. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," she whispered. He released her with a rough gesture, disappearing into the crowd toward a cluster of gentlemen whose expressions suggested they were discussing matters of consequence. Finance, perhaps, or politics. Henry Colton had a way of inserting himself into conversations where he was neither wanted nor needed, his title serving as sufficient entry. Louisa pulled her gloved hand against her skirts, trying to anchor herself in the present moment, rather than spiral into the anxiety that threatened to consume her. The evening progressed with its familiar rhythm. She observed the intricate dance of society from her peripheral position, noting how certain women commanded attention through their confidence, how others wielded their accomplishments like weapons. There was Lady Caroline Whitmore, resplendent in emerald silk, holding court near the potted palms. Her laughter seemed to bend the very air around her toward her will. For a moment Louisa wondered what that must feel like, to take up space without apologizing for it. The orchestra began a new selection, and the crowd shifted. Then came the announcement that altered the evening's careful equilibrium. His Grace, Julian Wayford, the 6th Duke of Kensington. The murmur that rippled through the assembly was not mere acknowledgement. It was something closer to reverence mixed with curiosity. The Duke of Kensington emerged in the ballroom's entrance with the bearing of a man accustomed to having space arrange itself according to his presence. He was tall, his evening attire impeccable in its severity. Black coat, white cravat, the austere elegance of someone who required no embellishment to convey authority. His dark hair caught the candlelight, and his eyes moved across the assembly with the detachment of a naturalist observing creatures in their native habitat. Louisa recognized him from descriptions she had overheard. 2 years of mourning had recently concluded. His wife had succumbed to consumption shortly after their union. There had been whispers of his devotion, his retreat from society, his apparent indifference to the parade of eligible young ladies who had subsequently presented themselves for his consideration. At 33, he remained the most sought-after bachelor in England, his wealth ancient and substantial, his title among the oldest in the realm. Yet there was something in his expression that suggested he found the proceedings tedious at best. He moved through the assembled company without particular destination, acknowledging greetings with minimal courtesy. Most people he regarded with polite disinterest, but his attention seemed to sharpen occasionally, as though he were cataloging some essential truth about the people he encountered. He did not at first appear to notice her. Louisa had learned long ago to recognize when she was being observed. It was a survival mechanism born of years spent in proximity to a man whose moods could shift without warning, whose attention often preceded correction. Yet the sensation that came over her when she felt the Duke's gaze settle upon her was unfamiliar. It was not the pointed interest of courtship or the clinical appraisal of a marriage market participant. It was something more complex. The look of someone who had noticed an inconsistency and was attempting to solve it. She did not turn to meet his eyes. Instead, she allowed her own gaze to drift toward the terrace doors, where the night air stirred the curtains. Her heart had begun to accelerate in that particular way it did when she sensed examination, when she felt the possibility of unwanted attention. She wanted to fade further into the shadows, to become so thoroughly unremarkable that even her presence could be questioned. The music changed, and most of the company shifted with it. An interval occurred, and Louisa believed she might retreat further, or perhaps excuse herself to the ladies' retiring room, where she might find a measure of peace and solitude. But as she turned, she found her path obstructed. "Miss Hartwell, I believe." The voice was measured, neither warm nor cold. Louisa lifted her eyes to encounter the Duke's regard directly. His gaze was penetrating in a way that suggested he saw past the confection of social pleasantry to something beneath. "Would you honor me with this dance?" The question hung in the air between them, impossibly direct. Around them, the assembly registered shock in the smallest adjustments of posture and meaningful glances. The Duke of Kensington did not approach unmarked women in corners. The Duke of Kensington had declined dances with the season's most celebrated beauties, the daughters of important families. The young ladies presented specifically with his consideration in mind. "Your Grace," Louisa began, her voice barely audible above the renewed strains of the orchestra, "I fear you have mistaken me for someone else. I am not accustomed to making mistakes, Miss Hartwell." The faintest suggestion of amusement touched the corner of his mouth. "The waltz awaits. Will you do me the honor?" To refuse would be to create a scene. To accept would be to invite speculation and, more pressingly, Henry's inevitable displeasure. Louisa felt the weight of both choices settle upon her shoulders. She placed her hand in his, and they moved toward the dance floor, leaving in their wake a tide of curious observation. As they took their positions, she registered the breadth of his shoulders, the confidence with which he held himself. His hand settled at her waist, and Louisa found herself waiting for the familiar flinch that accompanied most physical contact. The response came unbidden, a sudden tightening of her muscles, a reflexive drawing inward. She saw his eyes sharpen with recognition, saw the moment he registered something beyond the surface. The music began, and he led her through the opening movements of the waltz with assurance. He danced well, his steps precise and graceful, their progression across the floor seamless despite her initial rigidity. As they turned, his hand shifted slightly, and when the fabric of her sleeve drew back, he saw what she had spent considerable effort concealing. There, visible between her glove and the cuff of her gown, were marks. Faint bruising along her inner wrist, older scars visible in lighter lines against her pale skin. Their eyes met for a suspended moment. Louisa saw the instant his expression transformed from polite interest to something sharper, something that suggested he had seen the evidence and understood, at least partially, what it implied. She looked away, focusing on the buttons of his coat, but she had already sensed the shift in him, the gathering of attention, the activation of some protective instinct she had not anticipated. When the waltz concluded, he escorted her from the dance floor with the same courtesy he had displayed at its commencement, though something had altered between them. Before departing, he bent slightly near her ear, and she caught the faint scent of sandalwood and leather. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Hartwell," he said quietly. It was without question the highlight of an otherwise unbearable evening. Then he withdrew, moving through the crowd with that same combination of authority and distance that marked his passage through the ballroom. Louisa stood motionless, her hand still suspended in the position it had occupied in his, trying to process what had just transpired. Later, after Henry had made his irritable departure, and she sat in the carriage beside him as it rattled through the lamp-lit streets of London, his expression grew darker with each passing block. "What were you thinking, dancing with Kensington?" His voice carried the particular edge of controlled fury that preceded violence. "Do you imagine yourself worthy of his attention? Do you believe yourself some prize to be admired?" Louisa said nothing, having learned that words often accelerated rather than mitigated his anger. She gazed out the window at the gas lamps flickering past, at the city she could see but never quite touch, and wondered why the Duke had looked at her marks with such intensity. She wondered what he intended to do with that knowledge. Most importantly, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake by allowing him to see her at all. The days following the Heartswood ball passed in a state of heightened tension for Louisa. She found herself existing in a peculiar state of suspended dread, waiting for consequences that seemed inevitable yet remained tantalizingly distant. Henry had not struck her outright, though his manner had grown colder, his silences more pointed. She understood this atmosphere well enough. It was the gathering storm before violence, the deliberate withdrawal of ordinary civility that often preceded his worst impulses. What occupied her more insistently, however, was the memory of the Duke's penetrating gaze. The way his eyes had registered recognition when he saw her wrists. She had made an error in allowing him so close, in permitting his examination of her marked skin. The realization sat heavily in her chest, a constant low-level anxiety that competed with her existing concerns about Henry's escalating unpredictability. 3 weeks after the ball, a letter arrived at Colton House. It bore the Kensington seal, an ornate crest that caused Henry's expression to shift from habitual irritation to something approximating interest. The invitation was for Louisa and her guardian to dine at the Duke's London residence on what he had noticed was not beauty but evidence, a wrist a gentleman ought never to see, and scars no gentleman could ignore. Curiosity soured into purpose. Grosvenor Square. Henry read it twice, his eyes narrowing with calculation. "This is unprecedented," he muttered, turning the letter over in his hands as though it might reveal additional information through its reverse side. "Kensington does not extend social invitations to our standing without considerable purpose." Louisa said nothing, occupying herself with the needlework she had abandoned earlier that morning. Her hands remained steady through sheer force of will, though her mind raced through possibilities. Why would the Duke invite them both? What did he intend to accomplish through such a gesture? When the evening of the dinner arrived, Louisa, dressed in her best available gown, a pale silk that had once belonged to a cousin and had been altered to approximate her measurements. It was not fashionable by current standards, but it was respectable, and that would have to suffice. Henry wore his evening attire with the air of a man attending a coronation, his manner effusive and performative. The Duke's residence was exactly what one might expect of a man of his rank and resources. The rooms were appointed with the quiet confidence of accumulated wealth, the furnishings speaking of generations of refinement rather than the aggressive ostentation that characterized so many attempts at aristocratic display. The Duke received them in a drawing room of considerable proportions, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and paintings of considerable merit. "Mr. Colton, Miss Hartwell," he greeted them with formal courtesy. "I am grateful you accepted the invitation. Business has kept me occupied these past weeks, and I find myself behind in my social obligations." Throughout the dinner, the Duke conducted himself with meticulous politeness toward both guests. Yet Louisa noticed the particular quality of his observation when he regarded her across the table. He asked her questions about her reading habits, her opinions on matters of literature and philosophy, her thoughts on the management of country estates. Each inquiry was framed in such a manner as to invite genuine response rather than mere social platitude. Henry, meanwhile, transformed into someone almost unrecognizable. His manner became ingratiatingly pleasant, his laughter punctuated at strategic intervals, his conversation peppered with careful compliments and strategic inquiries about the Duke's business enterprises. Louisa recognized the performance. It was the same elaborate construction Henry employed when seeking advantage, when positioning himself as a man of understanding and substance. At one point during the second course, the Duke reached toward the serving dish between him and Louisa, and in doing so, his hand passed briefly near her arm. She felt the familiar involuntary contraction of her muscles, the bodily response she had been unable to suppress no matter how vigilantly she attempted to control it. Her hand stilled over her plate. When she risked a glance upward, she found the Duke's gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that suggested he had noticed her reaction and filed it away for later consideration. After dinner concluded, the Duke proposed an excursion to the British Museum. They moved past cabinets of shells and minerals, past drawers of pressed fronds and penciled herbariums, labels neat in a clerk's hand, where a mind could linger without society's theater to intrude. suggesting that the recent acquisitions to the natural philosophy collection warranted examination. He extended the invitation specifically to Louisa, remarking that he had observed her reading a treatise on botanical illustration during their dinner conversation and imagined she would find the specimens of particular interest. Henry, unable to refuse without creating offense, agreed to the arrangement, though his displeasure at being excluded from the proposed outing manifested in the tightening of his jaw. The morning of their visit to the museum arrived clear and temperate, the kind of London summer day that rendered the city almost bearable. The Duke's carriage collected them with punctuality that suggested meticulous planning. Louisa found herself seated across from him during the journey, acutely aware of the implications such proximity carried. "You seemed uncomfortable during dinner last evening," he observed, his tone remarkably devoid of judgment. It was a simple statement of fact, rather than an accusation or inquiry. "I am often uncomfortable in new situations, Your Grace," Louisa replied carefully. "Society does not always reward those of retiring temperament. I suspect your discomfort derives from sources somewhat more specific than mere social diffidence," he continued, his gaze passing over her as though assessing something beneath the surface of her carefully maintained composure. "Nevertheless, I hope you will find this outing more agreeable. The museum affords opportunity for contemplation without the constant surveillance of society's judgment." They spent the afternoon moving through the carefully curated specimens on display. The Duke proved to be a knowledgeable guide, offering insights into the botanical specimens with the ease of someone genuinely invested in the subject matter, rather than merely performing erudition for effect. More significantly, he listened to her observations with an attentiveness that bordered on reverential, treating her thoughts as though they possessed genuine substance and merit. At one point, while they stood before a particularly striking collection of fern specimens, a gentleman of Louisa's acquaintance approached their group. Before any introduction could be effected, Henry appeared at Louisa's other side, his hand settling heavily upon her shoulder. "My ward has a tendency toward fanciful thinking," Henry announced to the stranger, his tone pitched between affection and warning. "She concerns herself overmuch with intellectual matters, rather than attending to the practical realities of her situation. Books are all well and sufficient for occasional amusement, but a woman must remember her proper sphere." Louisa felt the weight of Henry's hand increase fractionally, a subtle assertion of ownership and dominance. Her throat constricted with the effort of maintaining her outward composure. The Duke's expression did not visibly alter, yet something crystallized in his demeanor, a hardening that suggested his mind had registered Henry's statement and filed it alongside the other accumulating evidence. When he spoke, his voice remained perfectly modulated, yet there resided within it an undertone of something darker. "I have found Miss Hartwell's observations regarding natural philosophy to be remarkably astute," he said, addressing Henry with a courtesy that somehow managed to carry an undercurrent of implicit censure. "In my estimation, intellectual curiosity represents a quality of considerable value in any person, regardless of their sex. The world benefits from minds that engage with ideas rather than remaining passively receptive to existing doctrine." The remainder of their time at the museum proceeded without further incident, though the temperature of the atmosphere had demonstrably altered. Henry maintained his cordial facade, yet Louisa detected in him a nascent awareness that the Duke represented something beyond the typical aristocratic observer he might manipulate or impress through conventional means. Weeks passed in a state of mounting tension. The Duke began extending invitations with increasing frequency. A musical evening, a carriage ride through Hyde Park, afternoon conversations in various salons where society gathered. Each occasion afforded him opportunity for observation, for the accumulation of detail that seemed to obsess him with the intensity of a natural philosopher studying a particularly complex specimen. It was during this period that he engaged the services of Nathaniel Price, a man of investigative acuity whose methods were as discreet as they were effective. Price interviewed servants from Colton House under the pretext of conducting routine inquiries regarding references for prospective employers. He spoke with the former governess who had overseen Louisa's early education, a woman whose loyalty to her former charge had never wavered despite her circumstances. He acquired copies of documents through channels both legitimate and otherwise, tracing the financial maze that constituted Henry's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain appearance of solvency. The information that emerged from Price's investigation was damning in its comprehensiveness. Here was Henry's mounting debt from gaming establishments, his fraudulent retention of Louisa's inheritance through forged guardianship documents that exploited the ambiguity of her legal status following her father's death. Here were accounts from servants detailing the pattern of physical discipline Henry administered, the systematic control through deprivation and psychological manipulation that characterized his treatment of his ward. One evening in August, Price delivered his complete findings to the Duke in the private study of his townhouse. The report was methodical in its documentation, clinical in its presentation of brutality transformed into bureaucratic record. The Duke read through it with increasing comprehension of what Louisa had endured, what she continued to endure in her current situation. When he finally set down the pages, his expression had become something formidable, a controlled fury that sought not immediate expression, but rather cold, deliberate action. He understood now why she had flinched at his touch, why she navigated the world as though perpetually bracing for impact. More importantly, he understood that her situation was not merely a matter of social impropriety or familial dysfunction, but rather systematic exploitation that crossed into criminality on multiple fronts. He rose from his chair and moved to the window overlooking the London street below, where evening had begun its descent and gas lamps flickered to life along the thoroughfares. Whatever intentions had initially guided his investigation, mere curiosity about an unusual young woman perhaps, or the satisfaction of puzzles solved, had transformed into something far more pressing. He had become the sole person in possession of comprehensive knowledge regarding Louisa's circumstances, and he was beginning to understand that her liberation from her current situation required more than mere observation or sympathetic interest. It required intervention of a kind that would necessarily reshape the trajectory of both their lives. The final collapse of Henry Colton's financial circumstances arrived with the inevitability of a sentence long pronounced but not yet executed. The creditor who appeared at Colton House in early August did so with the manner of a man accustomed to collecting debts by whatever means became necessary. He was accompanied by a solicitor whose presence suggested the matter had exceeded the boundaries of informal arrangement and entered the realm of legal proceeding. Henry received them in the study, his face flushing progressively darker as the creditor detailed the comprehensive nature of his insolvency. The sum owed had accumulated beyond the initial debt through penalties and the compounding effects of delayed payment. The deadline was mercifully clear. 7 days to remit the full amount, or the entire contents of the house would be seized and sold at auction. Henry's creditors extended no further patience. After they departed, the house fell into an oppressive silence. Louisa occupied herself with needlework in the drawing room when Henry located her, his expression conveying the particular species of desperation that preceded his worst impulses. He moved through the room with agitated energy, his fingers clenching and unclenching as though grasping at solutions that remained perpetually beyond reach. "We shall manage this," he announced to no one in particular, though his gaze fixed upon Louisa. "There remains a solution that resolves everything." She did not look up from her stitching, though her hands had stilled. She recognized the quality of his voice, the artificial brightness that masked something far more sinister beneath. "You shall marry," he continued, settling into the chair opposite hers with the air of a man who had reached an extraordinary and brilliant conclusion. "Immediately. The Viscount Ashworth has expressed interest in taking a wife. His finances are secure, and he cares nothing for the matter of a dower. In fact, he prefers the arrangement precisely because it removes any expectation of familial entanglement." Louisa's needle remained suspended. She had heard fragments of conversation regarding Viscount Ashworth, a man of some 50 years whose previous 2 wives had died under circumstances that society chose not to examine too closely. His preferences for the application of physical correction were sufficiently well known that few families possessed the desperation to accept his proposals. "I will not," she said quietly. The statement hung between them, an unprecedented assertion. In all her years under Henry's guardianship, Louisa had developed strategies of passive acceptance, of creating the appearance of compliance while withdrawing into whatever internal spaces remained her own. She had never refused him so directly, never articulated resistance in language so unambiguous. Henry's expression underwent a transformation that moved from surprise to something considerably more dangerous. He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, and Louisa experienced a moment of acute clarity regarding what she had initiated. Some portion of her mind recognized the escalation she had precipitated, understood that words spoken could not be withdrawn or reframed, that consequences would necessarily follow. "You will do precisely as I direct," he said, his voice dropping to the particular register that signaled imminent violence. "Do you comprehend? You exist through my sufferance, and your compliance is not subject to negotiation." When he struck her, it was with the walking stick he kept beside his chair, and the impact was delivered with sufficient force to drive the breath from her body. She fell against the sofa, her arm rising in reflexive protection. He continued his assault with a methodical quality that suggested intention rather than momentary fury, striking her ribs and shoulders until her attempts at self-defense had dissolved into simple survival. Afterward, she could not rise from the floor immediately. She remained where she had collapsed, her breathing shallow and labored, her body manifesting a map of pain that suggested considerable damage to the tissue beneath her clothing. Margaret found her there an hour later and helped her to her chamber, where she remained for 3 days. The movement necessary to leave her bed, a negotiation between her desire to function and her body's insistent communication that such exertion carried considerable cost. It was during this period that the Duke of Kensington invited Henry Colton to his townhouse for a conversation between gentlemen regarding matters of business and political opportunity. Henry accepted with alacrity, recognizing in the invitation precisely the sort of advantage he perpetually sought. He did not recognize it as the moment when his entire existence was about to undergo irreversible transformation. The Duke's study was appointed with the quiet confidence of accumulated wealth and meticulous taste. The Duke sat behind his desk with Price standing unobtrusively near the door, his presence suggesting that what would transpire would have multiple witnesses. The Duke's expression carried a quality of controlled fury that manifested not in volume or aggression, but in the absolute precision with which he articulated his observations. "I have become aware of certain matters concerning your guardianship of Miss Louisa Hartwell," the Duke began, his tone suggesting this was merely the commencement of a far more comprehensive indictment. "Specifically the matter of financial fraud, which includes the misappropriation of her inheritance and the deliberate falsification of guardianship documents." Henry's face underwent a rapid progression of expressions that traced the trajectory from incomprehension to terrified awareness. He began to speak, but the Duke continued without pause, systematically presenting the evidence that Price had accumulated. Financial records, forged documents, testimony from servants detailing the pattern of violence. The meticulousness of the presentation suggested that Henry's circumstances had been examined from every conceivable angle and found comprehensively damning. "Furthermore," the Duke continued, "I am aware of your recent proposal to marry Miss Hartwell to Viscount Ashworth for the purpose of resolving your financial distress. I am informed that you administered physical punishment to Miss Hartwell when she declined this arrangement." Henry attempted to defend himself, but his protestations carried the hollow quality of a man whose position had been entirely demolished. The Duke offered him 2 alternatives with the clarity of someone accustomed to exercising absolute authority. "You will depart England within 7 days, the Duke stated. "You will accept the modest allowance I have arranged, sufficient for comfortable living on the continent indefinitely. You will relinquish all claim to Miss Hartwell's guardianship and all rights to her inheritance. In exchange, I will refrain from presenting this evidence to the magistrate and pursuing the criminal charges that would necessarily result from such prosecution." "And if I refuse?" Henry asked, though his voice suggested he already recognized the futility of such defiance. "Then you will find yourself in custody within a fortnight, facing charges that will result in either transportation or imprisonment, depending upon the magistrate's mood. Your choice, Mr. Colton, is between comfortable obscurity or judicial reckoning. I strongly encourage the former." Within the hour, Henry had accepted terms. The financial arrangements were executed with efficiency that suggested careful pre-planning. Henry was provided with sufficient resources to establish himself in France, along with explicit instructions regarding what would occur should he attempt to return to England or maintain contact with Louisa. The Duke then engaged in a brief conversation with Viscount Ashworth, conducted through intermediary channels that protected the confidentiality necessary for negotiations of this nature. He offered Ashworth substantial compensation in exchange for the immediate withdrawal of his marriage proposal regarding Louisa. The Viscount, who had pursued the arrangement solely from mercenary motivation, accepted the financial settlement with alacrity and agreed to marry instead a recently widowed woman of considerable fortune whom the Duke's connections had identified. 7 days later, Henry Colton departed England. He traveled to Dover by private conveyance, boarded a packet boat bound for France, and disappeared into the continental obscurity that would characterize the remainder of his existence. The household staff at Colton House received notice that Miss Hartwell had been engaged to serve as companion to Lady Sophia Kensington at Wayford Park in Kent, a position that placed her beyond Henry's reach and removed her from the circumstances that had defined her existence. That night, London breathed as it always had, lamps guttering, wheels muttering along the stones, yet the city sounded altered, as if some hidden gear had finally slipped free. Louisa sat upright in her narrow bed and wrote one sentence again and again until her hand steadied. "I am not his ward." Only when the ink dried without blotting did she allow herself to weep. Louisa, still recovering from the violence of Henry's final assault, received this information from Margaret with a sense of unreality that suggested her mind could not accommodate the fundamental alteration of her circumstances. The woman who had been defined by powerlessness suddenly found herself separated from the source of her subjugation, not through her own efforts, but through the intervention of a man whose motivations remained opaque to her understanding. The question that occupied her consciousness was not gratitude, but rather apprehension regarding what this intervention might have obligated her to become. The carriage that transported Louisa from London moved through the Kent countryside with steady purpose, its interior lined with plush velvet that seemed almost obscene in its comfort compared to the years she had endured in Colton House. Margaret sat beside her, occasionally reaching over to squeeze her hand in a gesture of reassurance, though neither woman spoke extensively. The landscape beyond the windows transformed gradually from urban density to rolling estates, and Louisa found herself watching the transition with the awareness that something fundamental in her existence had shifted irrevocably. It was Margaret who first explained to her what had transpired during her recovery from Henry's final assault. The Duke had intervened, Margaret said, with a comprehensiveness that suggested military strategy rather than casual intervention. Henry had been removed from England entirely. Louisa was being placed under the guardianship of Lady Sophia Kensington, the Duke's mother, at Wayford Park. The arrangement was presented as permanent, though Margaret seemed uncertain about the precise legal mechanisms that rendered it so. "He knows," Louisa had whispered, her body still aching from Henry's violence. "About the marks. About everything." "Yes," Margaret acknowledged simply. "And he has decided it is his concern." The question that had consumed Louisa's thoughts for the duration of her recovery was far simpler than it should have been. Why? The Duke of Kensington bore no familial obligation to her. He possessed no personal stake in her liberation beyond the abstract principle that violence constituted impropriety. Yet he had expended considerable resources and social capital to effect her rescue from circumstances that society largely regarded as unremarkable. Women in her position were customarily dismissed as unfortunate rather than victimized, their suffering regarded as the consequence of poor family circumstances rather than systematic cruelty. When Julian visited Louisa before her departure, the conversation remained brief and formal. He brought with him a solicitor who presented documentation indicating that her legal status, while complex, had been sufficiently clarified to permit her access to a modest allowance from her inheritance. The remainder of her financial affairs would require ongoing legal proceeding to resolve the complications created by Henry's fraudulent documentation, but immediate destitution had been prevented. "Lady Sophia has extended an invitation for you to reside at Wayford Park as her companion," the Duke informed her with the measured courtesy he extended to all matters of business. "The position offers both security and opportunity for recovery from your recent difficulties. I trust such an arrangement will be acceptable to you." "Your Grace," Louisa had begun, uncertain how to articulate the contradiction between gratitude and the discomfort of owing such an immense debt. "I do not know how to repay—" "There is no debt," he interrupted, his expression suggesting that the very concept offended him. No exchange of currency or service is anticipated. You are free, Miss Hartwell. That is sufficient. The manor itself emerged from the landscape with the majesty of something that had existed since before memory. Ashworth occupied rolling grounds that suggested centuries of careful cultivation, its stone facade worn smooth by centuries of English weather. The interior revealed spaces of considerable dimension, their walls lined with paintings that suggested generations of connoisseurship and resources devoted to aesthetic accumulation rather than ostentation. Lady Sophia received Louisa with a graciousness that suggested she had been informed of the essential particulars regarding her new companion's circumstances without requiring elaboration. She was a woman of perhaps 60 years, her bearing suggesting refinement rather than the severity that sometimes characterized elderly aristocracy. Her eyes held a particular quality of intelligence that suggested she had encountered suffering and understood that it required gentle navigation rather than dismissal. You will find Ashworth offers solitude should you desire it, Lady Sophia offered by way of welcome, gesturing toward the drawing room where tea had been arranged. My son has indicated that recovery from your previous circumstances may require time and quiet. Such things are abundantly available here. Over the weeks that followed, Louisa discovered that the manor possessed remedial properties beyond the mere physical safety it provided. The library contained volumes that her father had mentioned but which she had never accessed. Literary treasures that she moved through with the reverence of someone encountering something sacred. The gardens offered walkways through carefully cultivated spaces where she could exist without observation or expectation. Margaret, to Louisa's profound relief, did not depart for some alternative employment. Instead, she accepted the position of housekeeper at Ashworth with a promotion that elevated her status beyond what she might otherwise have anticipated. She occupied chambers in the servants' quarters but maintained ready access to Louisa, and in the evenings when Louisa retreated to her chamber, Margaret often came with warm milk and the practical competence that characterized her navigation of crises. You are healing, Margaret observed one evening in November, as autumn had rendered the gardens increasingly austere. I see it in small ways. You ate more at supper yesterday than you have in weeks. You smiled when Lord Pemberton's nephew arrived for the holiday. Small things, but movement toward something resembling normal life. Physically, the transformation was undeniable. The bruises that had marked her body faded into yellowing memory before disappearing entirely. She gained weight, her frame filling out beyond the skeletal appearance malnutrition had imposed. The color returned to her skin. Her hair regained luster. Her eyes lost the perpetually hunted quality that had characterized her London existence. Psychologically, recovery proceeded with considerably more complexity. Louisa still experienced moments when sudden movement provoked the involuntary flinching that years of trauma had instilled. She remained uncertain in social situations, uncomfortable with attention, prone to silence rather than contribution. Yet these symptoms began to demonstrate gradual mitigation as weeks transformed into months, and Ashworth's atmosphere of safety began its subtle work of erosion upon the defensive structures she had constructed. Lady Sophia hosted occasional gatherings of a small and select nature. These events were orchestrated with consideration for Louisa's fragile equilibrium, guests carefully chosen for their discretion and compassionate temperament. A widow of similar age whose own marriage had been marked by difficulty. A clergyman whose sermons emphasized mercy rather than judgment. These individuals accepted Louisa's silence without demanding explanation or requiring her to participate in elaborate social performance. The library became the central geography of Louisa's existence at Ashworth. She moved through its volumes with the intensity of someone recovering something essential that had been violently severed. Her father's annotations appeared in margins, his intellectual engagement preserved in pencil marks and underlined passages. She read philosophy, natural history, poetry, allowing her mind to engage with ideas in the manner she had been forbidden to do for a decade. It was during one of these sessions, in late November, that Lady Sophia approached her with a matter of considerable practical significance. My son's solicitor has written regarding your legal affairs, the elder woman explained, settling into the chair opposite Louisa's with the deliberation of someone broaching something of importance. The complications surrounding your guardianship and inheritance remain subject to ongoing litigation, it appears. There are questions regarding whether the documentation Henry created retain any legal validity. and the process of establishing your true claims requires additional procedures. Louisa set down the book she had been reading. I do not understand the precise mechanics of such matters, Lady Sophia. What does this mean for my circumstances? Practically speaking, Lady Sophia continued, your situation remains somewhat ambiguous from a legal perspective. You possess access to modest funds, but complete control of your inheritance remains uncertain. In the estimation of Julian's solicitors, there exists only one method of resolving this ambiguity with finality: marriage. The word hung between them with the weight of considerable implications. Louisa felt the familiar contraction of anxiety that physical proximity to men still occasionally provoked, though she recognized it for what it was: trauma response rather than present danger. I cannot marry, she said quietly. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Lady Sophia regarded her with an expression suggesting she had anticipated this response. I am not suggesting you marry immediately, nor am I proposing any specific arrangement. I merely present to you the legal reality of your situation. In time, perhaps you will find the prospect less abhorrent. For now, you are safe. That remains sufficient. As autumn progressed toward winter, Louisa settled into the rhythms of Ashworth with increasing facility. She took meals with Lady Sophia, engaged in quiet conversation, attended services at the local parish church where she was introduced simply as a companion without elaborate explanation of her circumstances. Margaret reported that the household staff, having been given minimal information beyond the fact that Miss Hartwell had suffered family difficulties, accepted her presence without curiosity or judgment. Yet the fundamental question of her future remained suspended, unresolved, awaiting clarification that the legal complexities of her situation seemed determined not to provide. The months at Wayford Park unfolded with a rhythm that Louisa had never before experienced. The passage of time marked not by crisis or apprehension, but by the subtle accumulation of small improvements and gradual transformations. By early December, the rigorous structure of physical recovery had evolved into something more nuanced, a process of psychological reconstruction that proceeded with less predictable momentum. The bruises had faded entirely, leaving behind only the older scars that mapped her years of captivity. Her appetite had stabilized. She slept through most nights without the violent dreams that had characterized her initial weeks at the manor. Yet something remained suspended, unresolved, a persistent uncertainty regarding the geography of her own emotional landscape, and what she might expect from the future that stretched before her with unknowable dimensions. The library had become her sanctuary with increasing intentionality. She moved through its stacks with the reverence of a pilgrim navigating sacred space, her fingers tracing the spines of volumes that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. Her father had mentioned certain works during her childhood, authors and treatises that he had deemed worthy of engagement once she matured sufficiently to appreciate their complexity. Now she encountered them directly, advancing through philosophical arguments and literary constructions that occupied her mind with satisfying intensity. It was there that Julian began to spend his evenings with increasing frequency. He maintained his work, correspondence regarding his estates, matters of political significance that occasionally required consultation with his solicitors. But increasingly he abandoned the solitary confinement of his study in favor of the library's expansive atmosphere. He settled himself with deliberate casualness into the chair across from where Louisa typically positioned herself, his presence neither intrusive nor demanding particular acknowledgement. They did not initially speak. Louisa would register his arrival through the subtle alteration in air pressure and the familiar scent that accompanied him, sandalwood and leather mingled with something indefinably his own. She would glance up from her page, register his expression of focused attention directed toward his own volume, and return to her reading with the peculiar satisfaction of companionable silence. Hours would pass in this configuration, two individuals occupying the same space without requirement for verbal exchange, their shared presence sufficient unto itself. One evening in late November, as the fire in the library's hearth had burned down to embers, and the candles had begun to gutter with diminishing resource, Louisa mentioned with careful casualness that she had been experiencing difficulties with sleep. Not the violent nightmares that had characterized her initial trauma, but rather an anxious wakefulness that persisted despite her physical exhaustion. She would lie in darkness, her mind circling through concerns that never quite coalesced into specific anxieties, just an undifferentiated dread that manifested in the premature cessation of rest. Sometimes, Julian had observed, his attention remaining ostensibly fixed upon his volume. The presence of another person during such episodes proves restorative. Not through conversation necessarily, but simply through the assertion that one is not entirely alone within the darkness. Louisa had not responded immediately, parsing the implications of his statement, recognizing within it both offer and acceptance of refusal should she choose to decline. She had learned to read Julian's manner with increasing sophistication, to understand that the careful neutrality of his expression frequently concealed far more complex internal processes. Would that be acceptable? She had asked finally. Entirely acceptable, he had confirmed. I shall position myself in the chair adjacent to the chaise. I will read. You will rest. If you desire conversation, it will be provided. If you prefer silence, that too will be honored. The arrangement had begun that very evening. Julian had appeared in her chamber, with impeccable propriety. Margaret stationed in the adjacent dressing room should her presence be required, and had settled himself with a volume of poetry. He had selected his selections with evident deliberation, choosing narratives that suggested comfort rather than complexity, stories of journeys undertaken and destinations eventually reached. He read with measured pace, his voice providing a steady anchor to which Louisa could attach her attention as sleep gradually accumulated its claims upon her consciousness. Over the weeks that followed, the configuration had become established ritual. Louisa would retire to her chamber, Margaret would ensure that everything necessary had been arranged, and Julian would appear bearing his volume of selected readings. Some evenings he brought poetry, other occasions brought philosophy or historical narrative. The precise nature of the material mattered less than the consistency of his presence, the reliability of his voice moving through sentences with attentive care for punctuation and meaning. Somewhere within the first month of this routine, Louisa had ceased to flinch when Julian moved within her peripheral vision. The involuntary contraction of muscles that had accompanied proximity to any man had gradually diminished until it manifested only in the rarest of instances, and even then, with considerably less intensity. She began to register his presence as something neutral rather than inherently threatening, a distinction that represented considerable psychological distance from the terror that had characterized her earlier existence. You are improving, Margaret had observed one afternoon as she helped Louisa with her toilette. I see it in the way you move now. There was tension in your shoulders that has begun to release. Your smile reaches your eyes occasionally, which it did not before. I do not feel particularly improved, Louisa had replied, though she recognized the truth of Margaret's observation. I feel as though I am simply existing in a state of suspended provisional safety, awaiting the moment when circumstances return to their proper configuration of difficulty. That is trauma speaking, Margaret had said with the straightforward compassion that characterized her approach to difficult subjects. Your mind has learned to expect betrayal because that has been your consistent experience. Learning to expect otherwise will require time. By December, as the season progressed toward its darkest point, the intimacy of their evening readings had evolved in subtle but undeniable ways. One night, as Julian read, Louisa had allowed her hand to rest upon the arm of the chaise closest to his chair. The proximity was minimal, the contact non-existent, yet the implicit vulnerability of the gesture had caused something fundamental to shift in the atmosphere between them. Julian had paused mid-sentence, his attention registering the alteration of her positioning. When he resumed his reading, his voice had carried a particular quality that suggested recognition of the significance embedded within her movement. The passages he selected from that evening onward had begun to contain more deliberate references to connection, to the possibility of trust, to the redemptive capacity of genuine care extended without expectation of reciprocation or return. One particularly clear evening, as frost had begun to accumulate upon the manor's windows, Julian had set aside his volume mid-reading with deliberate intention. Louisa had opened her eyes, uncertain whether his cessation of reading indicated some aspect of concern or merely transition to an alternative selection. If I were to touch your hand, he had asked, his tone suggesting he was inquiring about something of considerable importance. Would you experience that as threat or as something else entirely? Louisa had considered the question with genuine engagement rather than reflexive response. She had examined her internal landscape with careful attention, noting that her heart had accelerated, but not from the panic that had characterized such moments during her London existence. The acceleration seemed rather to derive from anticipation, from the prospect of something unknown and potentially significant. I do not believe I would experience it as threat, she had said finally, her voice barely exceeding whisper, though I cannot be entirely certain until the moment of occurrence. Julian had moved with extraordinary deliberation, his hand extending across the space between their chairs with a pace that permitted her to withdraw should she choose to do so. She had not withdrawn. Instead, she had allowed her own hand to meet his, and when contact occurred, it had been neither the violent shock she anticipated nor the cold constraint of obligation. It had been simply hands meeting in darkness, two people acknowledging through that contact something that existed between them but had never been articulated in language. They had remained positioned thus for an extended period, neither speaking, their connection speaking itself through the simple fact of its maintenance. When Julian had eventually withdrawn, it had been with reluctance that seemed to mirror her own. The moment had concluded but had not terminated. It had merely transformed into something that persisted within the architecture of their shared experience. Over the subsequent weeks, these moments of deliberate contact had accumulated with increasing frequency. A hand brushing her shoulder as Julian moved past her in the library. A moment when their fingers touched as they both reached for the same volume. The careful placement of his hand at the small of her back when they walked the manor's corridors. Each contact had been preceded by that same quality of inquiry, that implicit request for permission that transformed what might otherwise have been simple proximity into something far more meaningful. By the time Christmas arrived at Wayford Park, Louisa had begun to recognize within herself the stirrings of something that extended beyond gratitude or sympathy, or even simple appreciation. She had begun to recognize that she possessed the capacity to experience feelings of affection toward Julian that were separate and distinct from her need for his protection or her dependence upon his generosity. She had begun to understand that the boundaries between rescue and something far more complex had become substantially blurred. Yet the question that persisted, unresolved and increasingly urgent, remained suspended between them, the matter of her legal circumstances and the precarious uncertainty that characterized her future. By the first days of January 1815, the quiet of Wayford Park had taught Louisa the shape of safety, even as the law refused to name it. Early January brought with it the arrival of Julian's solicitor to Wayford Park, a gentleman of considerable years whose expression suggested he carried news of considerable significance. Louisa encountered him in the corridor outside the study, his leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm with the gravity of someone transporting matters of substantial import. She had continued her routine of library occupancy and quiet existence at the manor, unaware that the legal complexities surrounding her inheritance had undergone considerable development during the preceding months. Lady Sophia summoned her to the drawing room that afternoon, with the deliberate manner suggesting that what she had to communicate warranted private consultation. The elder woman had settled herself with embroidery, though her needle remained still as she gestured for Louisa to occupy the seat opposite her own. "My son's solicitor has been engaged with your affairs for some time," Lady Sophia began, her expression carrying the particular compassion she extended toward subjects requiring difficult navigation. "The complications surrounding Henry's documentation and your guardianship have proven more resistant to resolution than initially anticipated. There remain substantial questions regarding the legitimacy of documents, the status of your inheritance, and the precise mechanisms through which you might claim what rightfully constitutes your own resources." Louisa absorbed this information with the dawning awareness that her legal status, which she had assumed resolved through Julian's intervention, remained as ambiguous as it had been during her captivity. "The solicitor has advised," Lady Sophia continued, "that there exists only one method of resolving these complications with absolute finality. Marriage would alter your legal standing in ways that would render all prior ambiguities essentially moot. A husband would gain automatic rights regarding your inheritance, which would necessarily require the full clarification and integration of your assets into the marital estate." The word resonated through Louisa's consciousness with the force of something physical. Marriage. The concept that had served as tool of subjugation in Henry's calculations now emerged as potential liberation from legal uncertainty. The irony was not lost upon her. "I cannot marry," she had said quietly, though the statement emerged with less conviction than she intended. "My mind remains too fractured. My ability to maintain the emotional equilibrium such an arrangement would require too precarious." Lady Sophia set aside her embroidery with deliberate care. "I suggest not that you must marry immediately. Rather, I present to you the legal reality that governs women in our society. Marriage represents the primary mechanism through which independent agency becomes possible, precisely because it transfers guardianship from one male authority to another. The injustice of this system is not mitigated by understanding it, but understanding it permits strategic navigation." The conversation with Lady Sophia had unsettled something within Louisa's carefully maintained equilibrium. She had begun to recognize that her current existence, while infinitely preferable to her London captivity, remained inherently provisional. She occupied Ashworth through Julian's generosity, rather than through any legal claim to permanence. She existed in a state of dependence that, while benevolent, was dependence nonetheless. That evening, as Julian appeared in the library bearing his customary volume, Louisa had raised the matter with considerable deliberation. She had informed him that Lady Sophia had conveyed information regarding the legal complexities of her situation, that marriage apparently represented the sole viable mechanism for resolving the ambiguities that continued to characterize her status. Julian's expression had registered something that might have been resignation or perhaps strategic calculation. He had set aside his volume and had regarded her with the careful attention he extended to matters of genuine consequence. "Your circumstances are indeed complicated," he had acknowledged. "The documentation Henry created has rendered your inheritance simultaneously yours and not yours, depending upon which legal framework one applies. A marriage contract could resolve these contradictions with finality." "You are suggesting that I should marry," Louisa had said, her voice barely exceeding whisper. "I am suggesting nothing," he had replied with careful precision. "I am instead proposing that if marriage were to occur, it might be structured in ways that differ substantially from the conventions typically governing such arrangements." He had provided her with documentation several days later, papers prepared by his solicitor, that outlined the terms under which a marriage contract might be arranged. The document was extraordinary in its consideration of her position. Her inheritance would remain legally her own, transferred to her sole control rather than absorbed into the marital estate. She would retain rights to property and income that were never to be claimed by a spouse. She could refuse physical intimacy without legal consequence. She could divorce under specific circumstances, a provision that most women could never anticipate accessing. When Louisa had finished reading, she had wept in a manner she had not permitted herself to do since her arrival at Ashworth, not from despair but from the recognition that such a document represented the existence of someone who viewed her as equivalent rather than as property. "Who is to marry me?" she had asked finally, though she suspected she already understood the answer. "That depends entirely upon your inclinations," Julian had said, though something in his expression suggested that his own inclinations had long since solidified around a particular outcome. "If you object entirely to marriage, it is not a requirement. You may remain here indefinitely, secure in both your person and your circumstances. However, if you were willing to consider the prospect, I would petition you to consider me as a candidate, though I understand completely if such a union seems impossible given your recent history." Louisa had spent the subsequent weeks in profound contemplation regarding what his proposal entailed. She had walked the manor's gardens in solitary reflection, had occupied herself in the library with particular attention to poetry, exploring themes of trust and redemption, had engaged in extended conversation with Margaret regarding the practical and emotional dimensions of such a commitment. "He has given you something extraordinary," Margaret had observed one afternoon as she helped Louisa with the mending. "A choice. A genuine choice with no coercion, no manipulation, no threat embedded within it. That is not something most women receive in any circumstance, let alone regarding marriage. How can I distinguish between genuine affection and the performance of affection?" Louisa had asked. "How can I trust that he will not transform once legal ties are established, that his current consideration will not metamorphose into something more conventional and therefore more dangerous? You cannot." Margaret had said with the straightforward honesty that characterized her approach to difficult subjects. Trust is always an act of faith, but faith is not blindness. You have observed him for months now. You have encountered him in both formal and intimate contexts. What have you observed regarding the fundamental nature of his character? Louisa had considered this question with genuine engagement. She had thought about Julian's interactions with servants, about the respect he extended to his mother, about the care with which he had approached her own trauma and recovery. She had thought about the way he had never demanded anything from her, the way he had constructed their evening readings around her comfort, the way he had asked permission before each increment of physical proximity. By late January, as the season had begun its slow progression toward spring, Louisa had arrived at a decision that surprised her with its own clarity. She had found Julian in the library, where they had begun to spend nearly every evening, and had informed him simply that she would accept his proposal. Not from desperation or legal necessity, though those elements remained present, but from recognition that among the men she had encountered in her life, only he had demonstrated the capacity to see her as something beyond an object to be controlled or possessed. The preparations for marriage proceeded with the meticulous precision that characterized Julian's approach to matters of consequence. His solicitor arrived at Wayford Park with documents that represented months of careful legal construction, papers that transformed abstract promises into binding contractual language. The marriage settlement that emerged from this collaboration was extraordinary in its accommodation of Louisa's interests, particularly given the historical context in which such arrangements were conceived. The contract stipulated that Louisa's inheritance would remain entirely under her personal control, never transferring to Julian's authority, regardless of the legal conventions that typically governed married women's property. She retained the absolute right to retain her separate income and to manage her assets independently. Provisions for divorce were included, a radical inclusion that most women never anticipated having available to them. Physical intimacy was explicitly framed as consensual rather than obligatory, and she was guaranteed the legal right to refuse without consequence or recrimination. When Louisa reviewed these documents in the privacy of her chamber, she wept with an intensity that surprised her. The papers represented something she had never believed possible, a legal framework that acknowledged her as something beyond property, as a person whose interests and autonomy held value worth protecting through contractual mechanism. "He loves you," Margaret had said simply, observing her distress, "and he has spent considerable resources ensuring that his love does not translate into legal ownership." Word of the impending marriage circulated through the Kent neighborhood with the predictable velocity that characterized provincial social intelligence. Speculation flourished regarding the identity of the bride, the rapidity of the proceedings, the absence of substantial social announcement. Society that had largely overlooked Louisa's existence during her London years now found itself curious regarding the woman who had apparently captured the attention of the Duke of Kensington. Lady Sophia orchestrated the preparations, with the careful consideration that suggested she understood the significance of this moment for Louisa. She offered her daughter's wedding gowns from her own collection, garments of considerable elegance that had been preserved with meticulous care. From among these treasures, Louisa selected a gown of pale cream silk, its simplicity suggesting elegance rather than ostentation, its style contemporary yet timeless. The fabric possessed a luminosity that appeared to reflect the light, creating the impression of something ethereal rather than merely sartorial. "You look like yourself," Margaret observed as she arranged Louisa's hair on the morning of the ceremony. Not a performance of what a bride should appear to be, but an actual woman preparing for something that matters. The chapel at Wayford Park was small, its stone walls worn smooth by centuries of use. The gathering was intimate. Lady Sophia occupied the foremost position, her expression conveying approval and perhaps relief that her son had found someone capable of reciprocating his affections. Nathaniel Price stood as witness, his presence suggesting the significance Julian attached to having credible documentation of the proceedings. Margaret occupied a position of prominence, having been elevated from her role as housekeeper to something more closely resembling lady's companion in recognition of her loyalty to Louisa. The vicar conducted the ceremony with solemnity appropriate to the occasion. When he asked whether Louisa accepted Julian as her husband, she experienced a moment of extraordinary clarity regarding what she was undertaking. This was choice made freely, without coercion or manipulation, without the pervasive undercurrent of threat that had characterized Henry's dominance. She affirmed her acceptance with a voice that surprised her in its steadiness. When Julian placed the ring upon her finger, his hand trembled slightly, a manifestation of emotion that he typically maintained beneath careful control. As he bent to kiss her, the gesture was infinitely tender, a question posed and answered rather than a claim asserted. The evening following their marriage, Louisa retired to the marital chamber with a combination of anticipation and apprehension that she had not anticipated experiencing. Years of trauma had created associations between physical intimacy and threat that her rational mind understood would not manifest with Julian, but her body had not yet learned to trust. When he appeared sometime later, she perceived his careful attention to her emotional state, the way he had deliberately slowed his movements and articulated each intention through gesture and inquiry. "We need not proceed further than you are comfortable with," he had said, his voice carrying the particular gentleness he extended only to her. "There is no expectation, no obligation, no prescribed timeline for this aspect of our union." What unfolded over the subsequent hours was revelation rather than performance. Julian touched her with reverence, treating her body as something worthy of careful attention rather than as means to an end. When Louisa experienced moments of fear, he recognized them immediately and adjusted his approach without requiring explanation or apology. He kissed her wrists where the old scars remained visible, a gesture that transformed trauma into something acknowledged and honored rather than denied. By the time dawn infiltrated the chamber's curtains, Louisa had experienced physical intimacy that bore no resemblance to the violations she had endured. She had experienced pleasure as something divorced from shame or obligation, something that belonged entirely to her own agency and desire. She had experienced being held by someone who had clearly prioritized her comfort and her agency above his own needs. The weeks following their marriage revealed the deepest transformations. Louisa began to move through the manor with increasing confidence, her bearing no longer suggesting perpetual bracing for impact. She engaged in conversation with considerably more ease, no longer regarding her voice as something dangerous or unwelcome. Her smile, when it appeared, reached her eyes with genuine pleasure rather than representing mere social performance. Julian, meanwhile, demonstrated growing tenderness that seemed to compound daily. He consulted her opinions regarding estate matters, incorporating her suggestions into decisions affecting Ashworth's management. He ensured that opportunities for her continued intellectual engagement were maintained, expanding the library's collection with volumes he believed would interest her. Most significantly, he maintained the physical intimacy they had established, approaching each encounter with the same careful attentiveness that had characterized their first night together. 1 year had transformed the landscape of Louisa's existence in ways that she had not anticipated possible. The passage from autumn into the following winter, and then toward another spring, had marked not merely the rotation of seasons, but the fundamental alteration of her place within the world. January of 1816 arrived with its characteristic gray skies and bitter winds, and yet the atmosphere at Wayford Park was characterized by warmth and anticipation, rather than the austere coldness that typically accompanied this season. Louisa's pregnancy had become apparent by autumn, a revelation that had initially terrified her before gradually transforming into something resembling genuine anticipation. She had never permitted herself to imagine futures that extended beyond immediate survival, and the prospect of creating life within her own body represented something close to miraculous. Her body, which had been used as instrument of subjugation and control, was now generating new existence, a child that would be born into security and safety rather than the chaos and violence that had characterized her own entrance into the world. The transformation that society recognized in Louisa as she moved through the social season of London was remarked upon with the particular intensity that characterized aristocratic observation of significant alterations in status and appearance. The woman who had been dismissed as insignificant during her years under Henry's guardianship had emerged into prominence through the simple fact of becoming Duchess of Kensington. Yet society, ever perceptive regarding surface matters, had largely failed to recognize that the transformation extended far deeper than titles and elevated station. Louisa had begun to utilize her position with deliberate intention toward matters that occupied her conscience with increasing urgency. She had established connections with charitable organizations devoted to the protection and support of women who found themselves in circumstances resembling those from which she had been extracted. Her patronage was substantial, but more significantly, her personal engagement with these efforts demonstrated a commitment that transcended the superficial participation that typically characterized aristocratic women's involvement in charitable enterprises. It was during one such engagement that a young woman had approached her with hesitant urgency. The girl, barely past her 20th year, had managed to convey through whispered communication that her family situation mirrored aspects of Louisa's own, a stepfather whose affections extended into violence, a circumstance that society chose to regard as unfortunate rather than criminal. Louisa had offered without hesitation the network of support that had been unavailable to her during her own crisis. She had provided resources, connections, safe passage, and most importantly, the assertion that such circumstances were not inevitable or acceptable. "You saved me," the young woman had said, her gratitude manifesting in tears that suggested the relief of finally encountering someone who comprehended the weight she carried. "I offered resources," Louisa had replied with the precision that had become characteristic of her approach to such matters. "You saved yourself by accepting that salvation was possible." Henry Colton had died in the spring of 1815 in Dieppe, France, his passing occasioned by the consequences of excessive consumption of wine and laudanum. The news had reached Louisa through channels that were deliberately filtered to protect her from unnecessary distress. She had received word of his death without the complicated emotional response she might have anticipated. There existed no grief in her regarding his demise, no satisfaction in his suffering, merely a final confirmation that a chapter of her existence had concluded entirely. The social season of 1816 found Louisa navigating the ballrooms and drawing rooms of London society with an ease that suggested she had always occupied such spaces. Yet the transformation was profound for those observant enough to perceive it. Where she had once positioned herself in margins and shadows, she now occupied central space with the confidence of someone who had earned her position through authentic presence rather than social obligation. She wore her pregnancy with evident satisfaction rather than attempting to conceal it beneath concealing garments, a choice that scandalized some elements of society, even as it inspired quiet admiration among those who recognized the implicit assertion of bodily autonomy embedded within such a declaration. One afternoon, as Louisa rested in the library at Kensington House with her hand positioned across her swollen abdomen, Margaret entered bearing correspondence and tea. The older woman had accompanied Louisa from Ashworth to London, maintaining her role as confidant and companion despite her elevated position, as Margaret had become something approaching intimate friend rather than servant. "Letters from Ashworth," Margaret announced, arranging the correspondence upon the table beside Louisa. "Your mother-in-law writes that the preparations for the nursery are nearing completion. She expresses opinions regarding the appropriate furnishings for an infant of ducal status." Louisa smiled at this characterization of Lady Sophia's approach to the matter. "My mother-in-law has opinions regarding everything, though they are typically rendered with sufficient grace that one cannot take offense." That evening, as Julian entered the library where Louisa had spent the afternoon reading, he carried with him the particular gentleness that had become his customary demeanor toward her during her pregnancy. He settled beside her, his hand gravitating toward her abdomen where the child performed its increasingly forceful movements. "You are radiant," he had observed, a statement that she had heard frequently enough during recent months that she had ceased to dismiss it as mere courtly flattery. "I am substantial and uncomfortable," she had replied with the directness that characterized their private communication. "My feet ache. My back protests my posture. I am uncertain whether the sensations I experience constitute the movements of our child, or merely my own internal mechanisms rebelling against the demands I have imposed upon them. Yet you are radiant nonetheless," Julian had insisted, and she had recognized in his expression something approaching wonder. A man observing the physical reality of new life being created and regarding it with the reverence such a phenomenon warranted. As evening descended into night, Louisa permitted herself a moment of profound reflection regarding the distance she had traveled from the woman who had stood invisible in shadows at Lady Hartswood's ball. That woman had existed in perpetual anticipation of violence, had expected subjugation as the natural order of things, had possessed no framework through which to understand concepts such as safety or genuine affection. The woman she had become had learned to trust, had permitted herself vulnerability, without experiencing that vulnerability as liability, had begun to construct a future that belonged to her own vision, rather than conforming to the blueprints imposed by others. She had learned that healing was not a destination but rather a process of continuous engagement with one's own experience. That trauma left marks that would never entirely fade, but that need not define the entirety of one's existence. When the child, a daughter as Louisa had somehow known from the inception of pregnancy, was born in late March, she entered a world fundamentally different from the one Louisa had inhabited. This girl would be raised with the understanding that her body belonged to her alone, that her thoughts possessed value, that her choices would be honored. This girl would know her mother as a woman who had survived subjugation and emerged not merely intact, but transformed into something resembling flourishing. On the evening following her daughter's, on the last days of March 1816, with thawed light pooling at the casement, their daughter came quiet and angry and perfect. Birth, as Louisa held the infant against her chest in the peaceful quiet of the lying-in chamber, she experienced a moment of extraordinary clarity regarding the meaning of redemption. It was not erasure of the past, nor was it the achievement of some pristine state of innocence or purity. Rather, it was the possibility of continuing forward, of creating meaning from suffering, of permitting oneself to live rather than merely to survive. Margaret entered with warm linens and gentle hands, and in her expression Louisa recognized the satisfaction of a woman who had devoted herself to another's well-being and witnessed its fruits. "She is perfect," Margaret whispered, regarding the sleeping infant with wonder. "She is new," Louisa replied, permitting herself a smile. "That is perfection sufficient unto itself."